Hello, my name is Seok-Young. I am going to present my paper in this conference. The paper title is Analysis of Production Function in the Korean Accounting Industry, Further Evidence. Okay, so what is my research questions? My research question is what is the major determinant of the factors that affect the productivity of the accounting firms and in the accounting service industries? So more specifically, I want to take a look at what is the main moderating effect of firm characteristic on the relation between the output and input of the accounting firms. So, in order to address my research questions, so I consider production function relating the output of the accounting firms as a function of the input resources such as the labor and capital. Also, I'm going to consider contextual variable which moderates the relation between the output variable and input variables. Then, I need to define the output variables and input variables. Output variable is the total operating revenue, that's the for years. And in the case of the input variables, I consider three different types of input variables. They are for labor variables, number of the professionals, and number of the supporting personnel. And in addition to this kind of labor input resources, I also consider some capital factors of the facilities in terms of the book value of the non-current assets. So here, single output, and also I consider three different types of input resource variables. Then, in addition to this kind of input variables and output variable, also I consider different types of the contextual variable that moderates the relation between the output variable and input variable. First of all, I consider service mix. In the case of the accounting firms, they are providing three different types of areas of services. First one is the auditing service, second one is the taxation service, third one is the management advisory service or other services like that. Then, what is the proportion of the revenue from auditing services? That is the auditing proportions, and the proportion of the revenue from taxation services, that's the proportion of the tax. And also, I do consider the revenue, the proportion of the revenue from management advisory service, represented by MSP. If I add up these three components, that is the 100%. So, in our empirical models, obviously, I'm not able to consider all of these three variables, only consider two variables to avoid some linear combination problems. And also, I need to consider some service diversifications, how services are widely dispersed, how service areas are more concentrated. So by using these service diversifications, I'm going to use these formulas. That's consider this. If the measure is turned out to be equal to 0, that means the accounting firm is concentrate only one type of services. However, if the measure is approaching number 1, then that's a perfectly widely dispersed. That's the meaning of the service diversification. And also, I'm going to consider another strategies from the standpoint of the accounting firm. They could be mixed, some partners and non-partners. Here, leveraging of the partner times mean how many non-partner employees are used in order to leverage the knowledge and skill of the partners. So here's, we're going to consider this is the human resource management strategy variables. Also, here training cost per employees. Obviously, many service firms are investing quite a lot of the expenditure in developing their employees' expertise and etc. Therefore, I'm going to consider how training cost per employees in terms of million Korean won. Also, in the organizations, in order to improve the productivity, obviously, employee satisfaction is very important. To proxy for the employee satisfaction, I consider employee retention rate in terms of percentage terms. And also, I'm going to consider these two different types of financial variable of accounting firms, the ratio of the total liability to total equity, usually called debt to equity ratios. And also, I'm going to consider these types of another ratios, which is the reciprocal of the quick ratios. So obviously, by considering this kind of different types of the contextual variables, I do want to capture the main differences among the many accounting firms. And finally, I do want to also add control variables to control for the year fixed effect. I'm going to add indicator variable for each of the years. And also, I'm going to consider another control variables to control for the productivity change over the sample periods. So I'm going to add this another variables, number of the year passed since the start of the sample periods. So by using this type of input variable, output variable, quite a number of the contextual variable and control variables, I'm going to conduct my experimental analysis. Here is the summary of my research models. Here's the input variables. Two different types of labor input, professionals and supporting personnel. And in the case of capital representation, I'm going to consider book value of non-current assets. This is the single output variable, total operating revenue. Then, this is the input. This is the output. There might be some moderating effect by contextual and control variables. The first one is the service mix components. This is the service diversifications, and this is the leveraging of partner time and training cost per employees and employee retention rate. And here is the debt to equity ratio, reciprocal of the quick ratios, and the number of years passed since the start of the sample periods. And also, I consider year dummy, year indicator variable for each of the years. This is the summary of my research models. Then, in order to test this kind of the production functions, what kind of the production functions should be used? So here, let me introduce the data and samples. In the case of data, there are two different types of sources of data gatherings. One is from KICPA, Korean Institute of Certified Public Accountants. From this, I collected this period annual report of the Korean accounting firms. And the remaining periods, all the annual report of the Korean accounting firms were downloaded from the website of the Korean financial supervisory service. And sample period 22 years starting from 1997 until 2018. Final sample is 14 from year observation. Here, what is the interesting is in the first year of the sample periods, in 1999, there is only 32 accounting firms. But at the end of the sample periods, in 2018, there are 180 accounting firms. That means over the sample periods, time passes, the number of the accounting firms are growing very rapidly. It's interesting. So we need to control this kind of the time trend. That's very important. Then let's take a look at some descriptive statistics for output and input variables. Yeah, if you take a look at this slide, here, total operating revenue, number of partners, number of the non-partner CPAs. And by adding these two numbers, I define professionals. And in addition to this professional, they are employing other supporting personnel. That's the supporting. And by adding this one and this one, total number of employees. And also, I consider non-current assets book values. This is the data. Oh, this is the all input or output related variables. These all variables are size related. Take a look at the mean and medians. If you take a look at the mean and median, for each of the variables, mean is the far greater than the medians. This is the mean, this is the medians, far greater. And also, in everything, in every variable, greater. That means, what does that mean? The distribution of these size-related measures are skewed to the right. So, in terms of distribution is like this, skewed to the right. In other words, there are some number of the dominant firms. There are quite a number of the small accounting firms, but there is a big, large firms, such as the Samil, such as the Anjin, such as the Samjung, and such as the another Hanyang 회계법인 like this. So those guys are big guys, big four accounting firms. So that's the pretty much important situation in Korean accounting market. Now, let's take a look at some contextual variables. Oh, in terms of service mix, the proportion of the auditing, around 32%. The proportion of the tax, around 21%. But in the case of the proportion of the management and advisory service, around 47%. It's interesting. In the case of the leveraging of the partner time, 5. 5 means for each partner is using 5 additional employees in doing their job, in doing their audit, etc. And total training cost or employee retention rate is around 48%. In other words, turnover rate is around 16% like that. Also, we got some financial ratios and etc. So let's take a look at some time trend for every 7 years. Starting period, the sample period, 1997, right? The end of the sample period is 2018. 2018, like that. Every 7 years, I am providing the mean value of the variables. Here, as I mentioned before, 32. Oh, here, 69 firms. Here, 124 firms. Here, 180 firms. Over the time, during the whole sample periods, number of the accounting firms, number of firms are growing and growing. So 180. Compared to this is almost six times as many numbers of the accounting firms. Yeah. In the case of the total revenue, still even number of the firms are larger. Still, average their operating revenue is greater. That means compared to 1997, until now, the market is growing very rapidly. That's the main reason there are new entrants of new accounting firms like that. So here's partner, almost the same. CPA, number of the firm is growing, so smaller. Here is the smaller, and smaller in terms of investment. Here, much larger. Here, investment in non-current assets are smaller compared to the beginning of the sample periods. Now, let's take a look at some mean value of the contextual variable. It's a very interesting idea. Here, in the case of the proportion of the auditing, proportion of the revenue from auditing services, at the beginning, that's around 48%. But it's decreasing now around 29%. In the case of proportion of the taxation service, taxation revenues, keep growing up. Increasing. And also management accounting, MAS, the proportion of the revenue from management advisory service keep going up. This is the consistent trend. Also, here's leveraging of the partner time. It's getting smaller. Number of the people are smaller. In the case of training cost, it's interesting. Their investment, company's investment in human development. The average cost is the smallest. And in employee retention rate is more or less the same, etc. Now, and also, we're going to take a look at, we're going to take a whole sample into the subsample based on number of the total number of employees. Here is the big total number of the employees, accounting firm with more than 100 employees, big firms. Here's total number of employees is less than 40. This is the small firm and this is the big firms. We got this kind of data. This data is very obvious. Larger in input variable and output variable is larger. In the case of small firms, input variable and output variable smaller. That's pretty much natural and reasonable. Now, here is another interesting idea. In the case of auditing, proportion of the auditing revenues. Here, smaller. The bigger firms, they have a higher proportion of the auditing revenues. But in the case of management, the proportion of the management advisory service revenues, here, smaller. here is the much bigger. Interesting. And even in the case of the level, how many number of the employees are used in order to leverage the expertise and skills of our partners. Here, around 8 persons, 8 employees. In the small firms, around three people like this. And also, we're going to consider this kind of the other variables. Now, let's take a look at how can we derive our empirical models, our estimation models. So, in order to represent the relationship between input and outputs, I'm going to specify the following Cobb-Douglas production function. Cobb-Douglas production function. Here, this is the output variables. We have 3 different types of input variables. Here is the theta error terms. And this theta is defined by 7 or 8 different types of contextual variables. Then I'm gonna substitute this theta. I'm gonna substitute this equation 2 for these thetas. So I'm gonna substitute this one here, and from these equations, I'm gonna take the natural logarithm of the equation 1, both sides. Then I get the following estimation model number 1. This is the models, log linear models. This is the starting models, pretty much parsimonious model before considering controlling from year fixed effects. So, basic models and more full model is there. I'm going to add this kind of year dummy for each of the years to control for the year fixed effects. Okay, so this is the main model. In addition to this kind of estimation models. So instead of this kind of the year dummy, I do want to find out trend of the productivity changes over time. So this all year dummy can be replaced by this one variables. Here's, by focusing on this kind of variable, I do want to find out how productivity has gone up or gone down. That's the main intention of this kind of equation number 5. Okay, so here is the empirical research, estimation research. Yeah, here's input or estimate, parameter estimates are statistically significant. No wonders. Yeah, tax, very positive. Positive and in all the models, positive. And this is also positive and positive. Then, in terms of impact of tax proportion of the tax, in terms of the impact, in terms of the proportion of the management advisory service revenues. Take a look at this kind of the coefficient estimates. Oh, greater, right? Oh, here, graders and graders. Also, by adding up these 3 numbers, we're going to check whether 3 number is greater than number 1 in order to check our scale of economies. Oh, the coefficient of this, sum of this coefficient of 3 numbers is greater than 1. That means there exists scale of economies of scales. And here's very positive significantly positive, or significantly positive, significantly positive. That means, by diversifying their service areas, there might be some more productive input, more productive in revenue generations. So obviously this implication is there exists some economy of the scopes, right? And also here is the positive, and positive, and positive, and here's this variable is positive, but this variable turn out to be a negative. And in the equation number 5, we can, instead of this kind of the instead of this year dummy, here's we adding this kind of the variables, we got this kind of results. That means over time, for 22 years, the productivity has improved over the time in the Korean accounting industry. That's the main implications. Then here's the results of testing. P-level is less than 1%, less than 1%, less than 1%. This is the existence of the economies of scales. Yeah, here's which one is the more impact in generating the revenues? Tax. P's impact is greater than management advisor service proportions. That's the implications. Now, let's take a look at some subsamples. Here is the big groups and it's the small groups. Yeah, depending upon each subsample, there might be some different empirical results. In the previous slides, we consider whole samples. Now, I just consider some segments of the total samples. So we got some different results, but not that big difference. Here's, in the case of big, they are enjoying economies of scale. Yeah, here is the economy of scales. Here is the economy of scales. In this group, this is greater than 1, but in terms of statistical significance, not that significant at all. And here's significant, not significant, not significant. Here, too significant. So big groups and small group, in terms of the impact on revenue generation, the proportion of the tax is greater than the proportion of the management of advisory service revenues. That's the main implication. Now, let me summarize the main finding of these studies. First of all, I found out that there exists some increasing return to scale in the Korean accounting industry. In other words, there exist economies of scales. And the second implication is the economy of scopes. By expanding, by diversifying their service area, they are getting better off. So this is the meaning of the existence of the economy of scope in the Korean accounting industries. As I mentioned before in the previous slide, both of these taxation service and management advice service are very productive in generating total revenue. However, in terms of relative impact in generating total revenue, this is greater than this management advisory service. That's another finding. And also, we found out that baseline, this auditing service. By concentrating auditing service, accounting firms will be less productive in revenue generations. And we found out some number of the contextual variables. Yeah, or partner time, degree of the leveraging of the partner time, level of the investment in trainings, level of the employee retention rates, debt to equity ratio, and quick ratios are found to be positively associated with the firm productivities. Finally, during our whole sample periods, the level of the productivity in accounting industries is moving upwards. In other words, there must be a productivity improvement over the sample periods. That's all I found out from this empirical analysis. Okay, let me finish up my presentation. Thank you.